Let's see if we're okay there. Yay. Okay, everybody can see that all right? If not, raise your hands, but I can't see that anyway. So I'm assuming it's all fine. This is the presentation, the name of the talk. Just to clarify, that's not the name of the book. I'm working on a couple of different titles, but the title will probably have to do with a magazine that was published in China in 1960 called Spark, 生活, and that's, but this is actually a great title. Maybe I should just list this title of the talk for the overall book title. I'll tell you a bit about how I got involved with this topic. It's on people who are writing and rewriting the official story, the official narrative of China. And when I went back to China in 2008, after I was there for most of the 1990s, left in 01 and went back in 08, I was interested in religion, still interested in religion, but I was interested in sort of spiritual values, what was motivating people. And I found that what was driving a lot of people's were a revival of especially traditional religions such as Buddhism, which you see here from the Lama Temple in Beijing, folk traditions, which the government now has embraced as intangible cultural heritage. This is a folk practice in the Taihang Mountains, southwest of Beijing. Christianity, of course, and Islam have all grown, especially, I would say, though, with government support, Buddhism, Taoism, and folk practices. But I also realized that for many people, the search for truth and values, justice, had a different kind of dimension, one not found under the terms spirituality and religion. But for these people, they were motivated by a deeply held set of beliefs, many of them quite traditional, but they were more political goals. And I found that many of them were motivated by history. In the 1990s and 2000s, this was quite common. Using new digital technologies like the internet, many Chinese began exploring parts of Chinese history that were not widely discussed, such as the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution. This was an unusually open period of time when things like independent documentary films flourished, as well as underground journals. But since Xi Jinping took power in 2012, the costs of doing these works have grown. And yet, thousands of Chinese still engage in this, writing histories or fostering debate on sensitive chapters of the past. And this is what my book focuses on. It's on people who are engaged in.
Sorry to interrupt. I think there was an issue with your PowerPoint briefly.
Yeah, no, I had a blank slide for a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I just
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. I should have actually gone back to speaker view probably at that point.
That's okay.
But I wanted to focus on people who are active in China today. So these are not people who are well known perhaps in the West, like the historian Yang Jisheng, who wrote the great book on the Great Leap Famine called Tombstone. These people did a lot of their work in the 2000s or even the 1990s when archives were open. Instead, I'm interested in people who are doing their work today in Xi's China, in what many Western analysts call incorrectly, I think, a sort of perfect dictatorship, when we have every manner of digital technology being used to cow the population. And in fact, I think there's a surprising number of people who are still active and who are still motivated to engage in this. So one of them is in this picture here. His name is Tan He-cheng. And Mr. Tan is shown next to a tombstone of a family, of a mass murder that took place in the Cultural Revolution. These were people who had been earlier declared to be black elements, people who were part of the either intelligentsia, had worked for the KMT government, had been prostitutes, et cetera, in the pre-revolutionary time, and then after 1949 had been marginalized. And then in the Cultural Revolution, there's a widespread element to, or widespread effort to kill many of these people. And so there were orders, Mao did not explicitly issue the order, but in many, many localities, there were mass murders that took place. Mr. Tan has worked and published, also starting in the 1990s and the 2000s, but continuing today to uncover these massacres, especially in his home province of Hunan. And this is one case when it wasn't just some overzealous local officials, but it was a systematic effort by the county government to eliminate hundreds of people in their population, to kill them. And so these people were driven to a salt mine, or a limestone pit rather, and they were then clubbed in the back of the head and tossed into the pit. And then Mr. Tan later was able to recreate their stories and tell exactly what happened. This is one of the survivors. We went and visited her a couple of years ago, and we're doing, there's my wife, she was doing some sort of forensic photography, just to even document the actual scars and of these kinds of things. So people like this, you could say, well, this is all stuff that happened in the past. It happened half a century ago. The party's changed since then. But we see a consistent effort to control the historical narrative, one that has not diminished with time, but is actually almost picked up with time. And arguably, after the Cultural Revolution, there was a bit of an effort made at a reckoning with what had happened in the Cultural Revolution. In the early 1980s, some amends were made, some people got to see their files, their court cases, and this is how some of this information got released. But especially in the past decade or so, there's been a very, very strong effort to control history. These are also landscape shots in that area in Hunan. This river, for example, I mean, just to give you the scale of what happened. Again, it wasn't just a couple of people who were killed. This river was so choked with corpses that the small hydro dam downstream was so choked that with the corpses that it couldn't function for a year, and they had to fish all the dead bodies out of the river before the power dam could work again. And so, you know, I think that this is something that and again, you know, we sometimes say, oh gosh, all this happened again half a century ago. It's so long ago, it can't possibly matter. And in a way, I think sometimes we buy into this idea that China is changing so rapidly that stuff that happened last year is no longer relevant this year. Or if you haven't been to China in 6 months, you don't know what's really happening and that sort of thing. Probably something that I bought into as a journalist also, because journalists are sort of live in writing about the immediate moment. But, you know, when you think about these events, they're no older than the civil rights movement in the United States from the 1960s. They're not ancient history. These are all things that are within living memory of many people. You know, I can remember I grew up in Montreal in the 1960s and 70s, and there was a terrorist movement, and it still affected me. I can still remember going to school and not being able to open letterboxes because they were booby trapped sometimes. And it's just one of these things that, you know, even then as a child, you can remember that. And so people who are just a little bit older than I had direct experience and sometimes even participating in this. And in fact, the people running the country today had direct experience, and some of them were perpetrators and some of them were not. Some of them were victims. This is a portrait of 𝗦𝗽𝗍. 𝗦𝗽𝗍 is one of the people I mentioned in my book. He was personal secretary to Mao, and after the Cultural Revolution, he was rehabilitated, had a job for a little while, but then became sort of the patron saint of unofficial historians. Some of you may be familiar with his story. He helped found or helped to run a magazine called China Through the Ages, 𝗦𝗽𝗄𝗁𝗍. And he died just a couple of years ago, and now there's a high-profile court case going on over his diaries, which are at Stanford University in the institution, but which his widow wants to have returned to China. But people like 𝗦𝗽𝗍 were absolutely instrumental in helping many of these unofficial historians get started in the post-Cultural Revolution era, giving them venues to publish, especially old media venues like China Through the Ages, actual printed journals, and things like that. And so through the work of people like this, I think the movement really got started and only picked up afterwards. I began to interview many of the people who were involved in this in the 2010s, so after Xi Jinping took power. These are portraits of some of these people. Some of them you may recognize, some of them not. And they are people I have interviewed in for the New York Review of Books. At the New York Review of Books, there's a dedicated page to these interviews, Q&As with public intellectuals called Talking About China. And you can find that. It's actually, I think it's nybooks.com/talking-about-China. And so and many of these people are directly involved in this effort, in this contemporary effort to rewrite Chinese history, or to complete the missing pages, as they would see it, of Chinese history. People, the upper left-hand corner, for example, like the journalist Jiang Xue, 𝗏昱𝗲, Chen Xinhuo, 𝗲ហ៊吴延. Lower left-hand corner, Tiger Temple, second from the left, Ai Xiaoming, and the person second from the right, Hu Jie. And this is somebody I talk about a bit in the book. He was probably most active in the 90s and 2000s when he made a series of remarkable documentaries. So he's a little bit before the time that I'm describing, but I think he's still worth just mentioning briefly because he's so influential. His underground documentary films that he made with digital technology are known to many, many Chinese intellectuals. His movies have never been shown in China, essentially. They might have been shown, one might have been shown at one or two independent film festivals, but essentially never been shown in China. But he's made a point of not really caring about that and using digital technologies to spread his movies through significant numbers of people. I don't mean to give some Pollyannish story here about how digital technologies have triumphed over everything. I'm well aware that the internet is tightly controlled in China, but people like Mr. Hu, for example, when you meet him, you can freely copy his films. People they copy his films. They're never password protected or anything like that. He encourages them to be spread. They're all on YouTube, which he insists, even when he gets money from donors or when people have tried to support him, he always says, my first request is that they're put on YouTube. And again, people will say, well, YouTube is blocked in China, right? Of course, well, we all know that. But there are still millions of people, according to reliable estimates, tens of millions of people who use VPNs in China. Now, admittedly, many of these VPNs are not used to look up underground documentary films. They're probably used to chat on Facebook or for some thing like that, or to get some kind of a movie, or to download some scientific papers, or many other things. And many of the VPNs that show up as VPNs probably don't work. But I still think it's fair to say that there are tens of thousands of Chinese people, even if you just take, say, 1% of that number, who have VPNs and who use them. And of course, compared to 1.4 billion people, the people who see these kinds of films are proportionally very small. But I think the fact that people who are part of the intelligentsia, the critical thinking people in China, are able, by and large, to access this kind of material is significant in the long run. This is a sketchbook that he made, and these were lithograph prints that he later made and sold he had an exhibition in Paris a few years ago, and these are all things inspired by the movies that he's made on the famines and various other things like that. This is he made a film about this magazine that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk called Spark. This was made in 1960. There were only 2 issues of the magazine that were published. Some of you may be familiar with this story through the poet Lin Zhao, who the academic 𝗦𝗫𝗫𝗃 from Duke, right? Duke University, wrote a book of her called Blood Letters. She contributed some poems to this magazine. This magazine had a ridiculously small circulation. It was made by some students from Lanzhou University who experienced the Great Famine of 1958 to 1961 firsthand near Tianshui in Gansu province. And they had access to a mimeograph machine and then hand wrote this journal. It's not a great journal. It's not very big. It's only 2 pieces of paper folded. So it's 8 pages total. And they printed one and distributed it. And then they began to print another one. And then their effort was discovered. And the magazine was confiscated, and many of them were sent to labor camps, and a few of them were executed, including Lin Zhao, the poet. And these people, do I have a picture? No, I don't. I just have a real. This is from his movie about Spark. These people, their story could have just died, and we never would have heard of anything like Spark. Except that after the Cultural Revolution, some of the people got to look into their files. They saw this and they photographed it. They photographed the magazine. And then with time, slowly, this began to spread. People, and then especially, again, this is where the digital technologies kick in, especially with the advent of PDFs and the internet, people then made PDFs of the magazine. They put it online, and you can now easily find the complete, the 2 volumes, not complete, the complete works, but it's not that much. It's just several tens of thousands of characters, maybe 20,000 characters total. But this is, for many people, many public intellectuals in China today, this magazine was quite influential because, or still remains influential because, as this Chinese film scholar put it, she said, after reading this, I realized these are our ancestors. These are our forefathers. These are the people who were struggling with the same questions that we have today. They were struggling with them 60 years ago. And questions of what happens to a party when it has so much power, and when it's very hard to challenge the party, and when it's hard to express dissenting views, what kind of abuses of power take place. So these issues are all written about and analyzed very clearly by these students and grad students just in their 20s. I guess the oldest was 30, writing in 1960. 61, and written down in this magazine. And I think for many people, it's been revelatory to be able to see this. And so just as, the people I think who are thinking about this and who are inspired by this and working on these kinds of projects, I think they are playing the long game. They know that their work is not going to overthrow the Communist Party directly. I mean, we said how it's going to challenge the party. If it challenges the party, it's going to be in the long, long term, right? But I think that it still is really important to them, at least, that there is an effort made to correct the historical story, to show everything, and for Chinese people in China to be doing this. It's not the work of foreign scholars. It's by people trying to recreate things today. One of them I showed a picture of before, the journalist Jiang Xue, that's her pen name. She went, and for the magazine Jintian, or Today, which is published in Hong Kong, edited by the poet 𝗶𝗳𝗍𝗲. She wrote a very long 30,000-word essay about Spark and how she rediscovered the whole story in her backyard because she comes from Tianshui and she wasn't aware of it. And she began to ask about it and do interviews with survivors and to piece this together. So there had been a documentary film before by 𝗬𝗲𝗄 in the 2000s, and then I think it was only officially released in 2015 or something, but he did most of his work a few years earlier. But then over the past few years, she's gone back and has really tried to document and tell the story of this magazine and write it out in long form. Let me just, before I jump to that, I've been talking a lot about public intellectuals and their efforts to wrest control of history from the state. This, to me, is also a broader phenomenon. I could go into a little bit more detail on the next segment, but I'll just keep it brief because I want to give a chance for people to ask questions and so on. But there's also at the grassroots level, people want to know the history of their families, of their villages, of their organizations. So, for example, this is a temple fair outside of Beijing, Miaofengshan, takes place every year in the springtime. And people, for example, this group here, they perform at the temple fair, but they also have a religious background. These groups have a religious background, and many of them have quite a long history, going back into the early 19th century and the late 18th century. Much of this history was lost in the Cultural Revolution. These groups reconstituted themselves after the Cultural Revolution, and collected old photos of when they were reconstituted, and had oral histories made of the old people who were still alive. These oral histories have been made just in the past few years, and have been all collected in their own private archive. And these archives and these people are not interested in directly challenging the Communist Party in any way. This isn't a movement of dissent, but these oral histories describe in excruciating detail what happened in the Great Leap Forward, what happened in the Cultural Revolution, how people were humiliated, how people were killed. These are just ordinary people. They don't have a high educational level at all. We're talking about middle school at best, just telling their stories and writing this down. So I think of this also as part of a broader social movement that has not stopped, but has maybe picked up speed. And I mentioned before that this should not seem too strange to us as being so far in the past. And I just had some pictures just to remind us, that in America and also in the UK, people are still talking about events of the 19th century. For example, statues are toppled. And so if Americans, for example, can still get riled up and Europeans can get riled up about events of the 19th century, the Civil War, colonialism, then how much less surprising is it that Chinese people would still be interested in something that took place in their own lifetime, in the Cultural Revolution, in Tiananmen, in the coronavirus, all the citizen historians who jumped out of the woodwork a year and a half ago. Many of them were immediately silenced, but there were then diaries and stuff like that came out of that tried to tell a more complete picture. Sort of a remarkable outpouring. Only lasted for a short time, but it shows this, I think, pent-up demand. If you want to torque it a little bit and push a little bit into the political implications without going too far, we can say that authoritarian governments are, by and large, weak. Their Achilles heels, let's say their Achilles heel is usually history. This is a Soviet-era movement called Memorial. These people were trying to uncover the victims of Stalinism. And in the 1980s, they directly led to the Glasnost movement. There were protests in Soviet cities and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not saying China is anywhere near that happening. There's so many differences, but I think that it is true that authoritarian governments tend to, because they don't have a popular legitimacy, they tend to rely on history to legitimize themselves. So the Communist Party's myth is that history brought the party to power. All these other people tried to save China in the 19th century, there were well-meaning patriots like 林子虚 in the Opium War and so on and so forth. Even the Kuomintang has been rehabilitated to a degree as patriots who were trying, but ultimately were flawed. But that ultimately was only the Communist Party through the forces of history, through this mythical force of history that was brought to power. And so therefore, if people like Mr. Tan can challenge us and say, well, you were brought to power, but there may be another story about why you came to power and what you did once you got there, then that on some level undermines the party's story, which has been pushing especially hard this year, the 100th anniversary of the party's founding, as to why it came to power. So with that, and because I promised that I would keep myself to half an hour, I'll leave you with this picture of the river. There's my contact information. You can especially reach me at this email if anybody has follow-up questions or ideas, thoughts. I'm always happy to talk and to exchange emails and so on.